So now we start working with state management packages. My package of choice is called Riverpod. Now, why choose Riverpod? There's all these other state managements, and there's actually way more. There's probably like 20 or 30 at least. Why did I choose Riverpod out of all of them? For that, we're going to go to the Flutter documentation. If you go to development, then data and backend, state management, and you go to the state management options. You notice the recommended approach by Flutter is using something called provider. This isn't necessarily a state management solution. It's more of a way to easily provide data to your whole application. But people use it and you can turn it into a good state management solution. Now, according to Flutter, Riverpod is another good choice. It is very similar to provider, but it is compile safe and testable. And the story here is that provider is one of the first and best ways to manage state within your application. That's why it's the recommended approach by Flutter. Riverpod actually has the word provider in there, so P-R-O-V-I-D-E-R. So it's provider with the letters jumbled up, and it's made by the same person that made provider. But as he was trying to make provider better and better, he ran into some limitations. So Riverpod is a second iteration of his efforts into creating a full state management solution and making Flutter development easier. And I can see there's a ton of other state management options there. And it really just comes down mostly to preference. But I've been using Riverpod. A lot of people enjoy it. I think it does just enough to make state management with Flutter easy. The most important thing is to understand the concepts. If you understand the concepts of state management in general, you can switch to most of these state management solutions and work with them just fine. So that's why I choose Riverpod. Riverpod actually has 3 different packages. It has the regular Riverpod, which is not specifically for Flutter, and you can use it for Dart as well. You'll see it's the only one that has the Dart SDK highlighted. Then there's Hooks Riverpod, which uses a concept called hooks that allows you to use Riverpod with the least amount of code. But what we're going to do is we're going to use Flutter Riverpod. The reason I like to use this one is because it's not oversimplified like hooks, so you kind of get a good gist of what's going on under the hood. And it's specifically made for Flutter, so it works very nice with Flutter applications. Like I mentioned, state management needs to do 2 things. First, it needs to be able to manage and manipulate the data, and second, it needs to be able to update the UI. Riverpod does this using 2 concepts, provider and consumer. Now, if you remember in the last lesson how conveniently I named that one class provider, it's very similar to what's happening here. The providers provide the data to the rest of your application, and the consumer is the one that takes the provider in, and whenever it changes, it updates the UI. The way Riverpod is set up is there's different providers for different types of data. So there's a regular provider that just provides whatever you give it to the rest of your application. Then there's feature provider, which provides features to your whole application, but it gives you some nice safety features. For example, makes you handle loading and error states as well. String provider is very similar, but for streams. And the last one is the big special one that actually helps you with the whole data management and manipulating part. It's the one that I would call a full state management solution. With State Notifier, you can add functions. For example, on our counter, this is where we would add the add function. So that's a very high level of Riverpod, and we're going to walk through all of these, starting from the basics and diving deeper and deeper. So first, we need to actually define something to provide to the rest of our application. We're going to set up a file called providers.dart. Actually, before that, we need to add Flutter Riverpod as a dependency. So you can add it like that, and I'll add it to your code base, and now you can work with it. And actually, let me give a shout out to this extension called Flutter Riverpod Snippets, which makes it easier for you to create those providers because they provide little snippets that you just type out in a couple letters, and it gives you the whole syntax for the provider. So for our first provider, we're going to start writing a provider. This is from the snippets. You'll see provider pops up. If we click on it, it gives us a syntax. We're going to call this just a normal provider. And it's going to provide us a string value. We need to import Flutter Riverpod so it knows what's going on. And for that string, we're just going to have it return a string that says, I'm just a normal provider. Okay, now let's go back to our main.dart. Remember, we had to add it above our widgets in the widget tree in order for them to have access below it. So we need to do the same thing here. In this one, we're going to do it with something called a provider scope. and we need to import it from Flutter Riverpod package as well. So the provider scope here allows us access to all the providers which we're going to define within this providers.dart page. And actually, that's all the setup we need for the data part of things. Now, this is just a simple provider that allows you to access data anywhere. But when we move on to the next section, was actually showing that data. And for this, remember, we use a consumer. So here we put out a widget named consumer. And what this consumer does, it gives us this ref. So this ref is a reference to all the providers that we have. And in order to read those, we do ref.read, and we want to read our normal provider. And that's actually going to give us the string, so we want to make sure to return it in a text. And we want to make sure to actually return it first. And that's it. That's Riverpod, the very basis of it. And it says no provider scope was found, so we need to make sure to restart the application. And there we go. We're able to access this data anywhere within our application. Now this is oversimplified, so let's add a bunch of layers to this. So the first thing we did was we did ref.read. This reads a provider without listening to it. In this case, that definitely makes sense because there's no changes going on with this provider. But there's also ref.watch. So watch reads the provider and then also listens to any changes for it. So let's say this normal provider was something that could update, would be able to update it, and our UI will get updated automatically. But for this, let's keep it as a ref.read. Next thing I want to show you is something called consumer widget. So instead of having to write consumer every place where you want to use it, you can change the stateless widget to a consumer widget. And this consumer widget comes with that widget reference right within our build method. This is just to clean up your code to make it easier to write. It doesn't change anything about how it actually works. But you saw we needed to write the consumer first to get that reference. Now we have that reference already in our widget. So we can save it and it looks exactly the same. So let me walk through that because this is basically the gist of Riverpod. So first you need to create a place to manage and provide the data. We'll do that using providers. And in this case, we did it in a separate file, but you can do it anywhere. You define them here and they get provided to your application using a provider scope, which is set up at the top of your widget tree so everybody below can get access to that. And then you consume that information using a reference to those, which you can get using a consumer, and then you can either read or watch that specific provider. That's really the gist of Riverpod. The layers we're going to be adding on in the next lesson is we're going to be adding different types of providers. But the overall concepts of how it works are all covered here. Let's move on to future provider.